Erin Dunne, analyst with Vertical Systems Group, opened this debate session to the collected audience of press and analysts by discussing the importance of the topic to businesses and to the technology market. After introductions, she highlighted two concerns: how SDN can help with faster provisioning of networks and how such systems could be managed. Can SDN work in practice?
So the question is around application controls, and does that change the way networking works? I think first we have to assume that most applications, particularly cloud-oriented applications, assume the network is virtualized at some level. If they're containerized, they're going to be looking at what sort of container runtime system they're running on, and that's usually presented some sort of virtualized networking. I think one of the challenges for us as we look at traditional systems where they're sitting inside our own data centers is, can those applications span across both sides? And that's really the big challenge for us. We've seen such a quick movement from software-defined to really broadly software-defined to now software-defined data centers and networking running into the cloud. And that's really been a shift in a very short amount of time. And then the other thing is looking at how developers are also producing these applications. It used to be very much you'd build a service and you'd try and implement that service and it would live in one location. Today what we're seeing with Kubernetes and Docker and sort of different application modalities is that those applications are living anywhere. And that networking is also changing with that. So that really sets up the challenge for all of us, is how do you make that network abstraction happen as fast as possible and push as quickly as possible to have both consistency on-premise with your own networks, and how those connect up with other public networks as well, such as Azure, GCP, Google, etc. So I'll pass it over to
Russ. Can we keep up?
Sure thing. Well, that's a good question. And I think we kind of get enamored with the idea of fail fast often, but fail fast isn't good when you're putting up production applications out there and your users are dependent upon it to get their jobs done. That just isn't going to fly. So I think that we maybe are overdriving our headlights often and not providing the kind of visibility and control that the complexity that we're adding is really requiring. And that, I think, is one of the bigger challenges that we face as we try to move so fast in rolling out new services.
Erin Dunne then asked whether customers are willing to pay extra for these additional services.
Yeah, maybe just add a perspective that I think is maybe a little bit different, coming from mostly technology suppliers. I think there's a tendency when we look at the technologies to start from the bottom up. So I think, Scott, to your point earlier about SDN, and there was the focus really on the networking layer, applying software, building it up, then software-defined storage, and ultimately you get to this top of this. But what I think that many of us are really holding up as poster children are really software-defined businesses. And it's through that lens that they then figure out what are the technologies that need. So, and in fact, that is probably deeply proprietary. If you look at like an Uber or an Ancestry or Facebook, the top end of that, these are software-defined businesses, deeply proprietary. In fact, when you go lower and lower, it becomes completely open and standards-based technology. So I think in order for it to really gain traction and roots, it needs to be steeply aligned to what the business objectives are. It actually goes back to the previous panel, on intent and what you're doing with this. But I think that's a key to understanding what of these technologies will matter and how they then get assembled to ultimately drive your business, which will be then making or losing money one way or the other.
This is Sunit Chauhan with Nuage Networks. I just want to add to that a little bit. For those of you who don't know Nuage, we are part of Nokia in the business of providing connectivity, seamless, secure connectivity to workloads anywhere. And I think one of the trends that we've seen, whether it's SDN 1.0, SDN 2.0, is this secular movement towards the public clouds. There are certain trends that networking industry or us vendors in this industry are not going to control. We are not going to be able to control where users reside. We are not going to be able to control where applications reside. The challenge for us is to provide that secure, seamless connectivity on demand in a OpEx, CapEx model that spans all of these different domains. I think that's the challenge. And if we are building solutions that are siloed in certain domains, then we are not really solving the problem. So going back to the question about operational improvements and how do OSS, BSS systems interact, I think what is really important is that we have that abstraction layer at the top, but provide a single sort of abstraction northbound to these different systems, because you're not going to control where the applications reside. You're not going to control what applications users are running. And so that becomes an important aspect.
Nick King added that the time for investment payback for cloud-based technologies is now much shorter than before, which changes the economics of the industry. Jeff Baha added that costs can explode well beyond initial expectations.
Gregg Holzrichter, I'm Chief Marketing Officer at BigSwitch. As background, BigSwitch was one of the early providers of SDN coming out of Stanford. And actually, as we've ridden the hype cycle, to Scott's comment earlier, I think that SDN did go through this wave of sort of exuberance and then sort of went through the trough of disillusionment. We're now seeing, very, very robust rollouts, looking at this next generation approach to networking. And I think that when you look at software abstraction across both server and storage and networking, that is fundamental for both, your private cloud deployments as well as hybrid and public. One of the things that we were inspired by was looking at Facebook and Google, as was referenced from the last panel, and those organizations have fundamentally figured out ways to do things in a much more efficient way. What we've done is been able to take that as packaged software and allow that to be deployed across any organization. And so when you're looking at these organizations, whether it's enterprise or service provider providing pay-to-play, it's all about efficiency and automation. And I do think that it's all about the APIs and programmability, which has been sorely lacking in that networking silo until recently.
Yeah. Mike, I bet you have a comment there. I know you do.
I do. So thank you. Mike Frane, I'm the Vice President of Product Management for Windstream, which is a nationwide managed network service provider, unified communications, networking, and security services. So one of the things that we've found is, as customers are moving to this pay-to-play model and they're moving more of their applications and their capabilities to the cloud, is that they don't typically think of the entire chain, right? And so a lot of what we've been talking about, the intent-based marketing and the containerization all happens in the cloud, right? It happens at AWS, it happens at Azure, it happens in other locations. But they don't always think about how that data is going to get down to each of their individual endpoints, right? Which may be running on a T1 in an MPLS network, right? So as they look and they do these evaluations, they really have to ask themselves the questions: is my network ready, right? My cloud is ready, my strategy is ready, but my network may not be ready. And so in some cases, they find that they do have to augment their network or make changes via different technologies, different access types. So the pay-to-play model, they really need to look at it end-to-end and holistically is one of the things that we've found.
Erin Dunne then asked if specialized hardware was required, not just software.
No, I've spent the last 10 years in this SDN space. Initially on the data center side, I think the trends on the data center side are fairly clear. White box trend is real. There are still questions around how reliable some of those boxes are, but the trend around Broadcom-based ASICs and those boxes is quite real. On the universal CPE or the branch edge, this is where I think the trend is going to be much faster than the evolution that we saw in the data center. One of the things that is going to happen, at least from where we sit at Nuage, and what we see is it's not going to be your core routers and your core switches that are going to get disrupted very quickly, but the branch edge, which is where your edge routers are running, are very quickly going to get replaced by your x86 platforms.
I would add, I think what's more at risk is the integrated system than the specialized hardware. I think if you translate the specialized hardware to a proprietary edge router that runs that same vendor's software, then that's the same. Then I think, specialized equals a proprietary in that case. But I think even in the case that when we move to, my ears perk up when we say x86, which is server, we're very bullish on SD-WAN, but we still see that those platforms do need some amount of specialization. It doesn't mean that it takes it down a proprietary path, but it isn't necessarily just any old server will do. I think that is actually true across the board. When people think I need to go into virtualization, I need to get a bunch of servers, I'll just get somebody's. I think it's more than just somebody's or anybody's, and especially when you look at the edge, it's what's, I think now at risk are those more proprietary, specialized systems where you just can't unlock the hardware from the software.
So from the service provider space, right, it sounds well and good. The question is, who essentially foots that bill, right? Because most customers aren't going to have the compute at the premises, right? And there's only so much you can load onto a specific box, right? So, so from my perspective, what we've been describing is great, right? Customer clicks a button, downloads a new instance, spins up a new VM, and now I'm off and running, and I've got I've got SD-WAN, I've got a software-defined switch, I've got a firewall, and I've got a NID, right? But at some point in time, the amount of compute capacity in that box is going to get tapped, right? So, the real question, or one of the questions for me is, how do we enable this speed, right, while still, doing our best to get the customer the most optimum cost for the initial deployment, right? Because essentially you have to pay for it up front, whether or not the customer is going to spin up new services or not, right? For us, that's one of the big questions.
Yeah, just to build on that. So I think one of the really large sort of secular trends here is that software is eating the world. And if you look at some of the incumbent vendors, this concept of disaggregation, BigSwitch is software. Our software runs on top of industry standard hardware, in partnership with Dell, for example. And that type of partnership allows us to actually bring innovation to the market a lot more quickly than some of the larger proprietary switch by switch or box by box providers. And so as you see, just as VMware disrupted the x86 market 15 years ago with a smart software layer, a smart software layer can do the same thing and disrupt networking. And so having that concept of managing your entire network through a single pane of glass, not box by box, is that underpinning that allows you to get to intent-based. And I do think that as more and more of these organizations are looking to emulate Facebook and Google and get that much easier way of managing your network, just as you've seen that type of agility in the software, in the server and the storage silos, that actually leads to industry standardization and commoditization on the hardware side and much more innovation on the software side.
And after a final prophecy from VMware's Nick King about the emergence of new types of specialized hardware, Erin Dunne drew the formal part of the debate to a close.